The wind had a way of dragging sound across the valley that morning, long stretched-out whistles that slipped between the broken fence posts and rattled the dry sage brushing at the ground. It was the kind of wind that carried warnings. The kind that told you a day wasn't going to go in any direction you hoped it would. And for Clara Marin, that wind felt like a final straw on a pile already too heavy to bear. She stood with her hands braced on her hips, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground by the water trough. The cattle were restless as ever, lowing, shifting, jostling each other like the entire world owed them something more than hay and water. Maybe they weren't so different from her. Maybe they were just louder about it. Her voice rose sharply over the dragging wind. "I can't take this anymore." The words tore out of her before she could stop them, before she could think about how they'd sound echoing across the front pasture. She didn't mean for him to hear. She didn't mean for anyone to hear, but of course he did. He always did. Because Dawson Hale had ears like a hawk and the patience of a mountain. There he stood on the other side of the corral, sleeves rolled up, rope coiled around his forearm, and that look, God help her, that look on his face. Quiet amusement. Steady confidence, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth like he knew something she didn't, like he always knew something she didn't. Without lifting his head fully, he drawled, "Funny thing, Clara, you say that every time you get riled up, and yet here you are. Still talking it." She glared at him, the heat rising in her chest. "Don't start with me today, Dawson. Not today." He finally turned to face her, slow, unbothered, leaning one elbow on the fence like he had all the time in the world while hers was running out. "I ain't starting anything," he said, that smirk deepening just enough to get under her skin. "You're the one hollerin' at the dirt." Clara exhaled sharply and kicked a clump of mud off her boot. "It's not the dirt I'm hollerin' at," he shrugged. "Then holler at me if you want. But it ain't gonna change the work we got ahead of us." And that was the problem. The work never stopped. Dawn to dusk, day after day. Fence lines breaking, water pumps failing, cattle wandering off like they were determined to die somewhere inconvenient. And all the while, Dawson acted like none of it got to him. Like nothing ever got to him. Clara sometimes wondered what it would take to actually wipe that smug confidence off his face. A storm, maybe. A wildfire. The sky cracking open and swallowing the ranch whole. Even then, she suspected he'd just nod, adjust his hat, and say something like, "Reckon we'll need a new plan." But today she wasn't in the mood. She marched toward him, boots crunching through gravel and grass, frustration burning in her steps. Dawson watched her approach with that maddening calm, his arms crossing loosely over his chest. His rope dangled from one hand, swaying gently in the wind. She stopped barely 3 feet from him. "Dawson Hale," she said, voice low and tight, "if you smirk at me one more time today, I swear." He cut her off, still smirking. "You'll what? Leave? Quit? Throw another bucket at me?" His eyes glinted. "You ain't hit me once. By the way, your aim's terrible." Her jaw tightened. "That's because I'm trying not to kill you." "Well, I appreciate the restraint." "Dawson," he raised a hand casually. "Clara, your wound tighter than a calf rope after branding season. Sit a minute." "I'm not sitting." "Then stand and breathe." Same thing, her hands balled into fists. "You don't get to tell me to breathe." He gave a soft, knowing chuckle. "You're doing a bad job of it on your own." And that was it. Her frustration snapped like a dry twig under a boot heel. Clara swung around and paced away from him, muttering under her breath, arms flailing once like she needed to throw the whole sky away just to make space for a new one. Dawson watched her, quiet now, that smirk fading into something subtler, something almost concerned, though he'd never admit it. When she reached the fence post at the far corner, she braced herself against it, shoulders trembling, not from anger alone, from exhaustion, from everything piling up faster than she could shovel it away, from the weight of the ranch, the town's expectations, her family's legacy, and the miles-long list of things that kept going wrong. Dawson didn't approach right away. He knew better than that. He gave her moment, letting the wind steal her sigh and toss it somewhere across the pasture. Then he walked toward her, steady, slow, boots crunching the frostbitten grass in that unhurried rhythm she'd come to know too well. "Clara," he said softly once he reached her. "Talk to me." She didn't turn. "There's nothing to talk about." "Then why are you shaking?" "I'm not shaking, you are." Her voice cracked just slightly. "I'm just tired." "Tired ain't the same thing as breaking." She swallowed hard. "Feels like it." Dawson leaned his elbows on the fence beside her, giving her space but not distance. "What happened?" She hesitated, then quietly, "The mortgage. The notice came in last night." His jaw tightened just barely. "How bad?" "Bad enough." She met his eyes then, and for the first time all day, Dawson's smirk disappeared completely, but only for a heartbeat. Because moments later, like he couldn't stop himself, he straightened up, lifted his chin, and said with that infuriating steadiness, "Well then, we got work to do." Clara closed her eyes. "Dawson, no." He shook his head firmly. "You listen to me. You ain't quitting. Not today, not tomorrow, not next month, not ever. This ranch ain't going under while you're standing on it. Hear me?" Her voice cracked again. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand plenty." Then he smirked, slow, deliberate, utterly maddening. "And I ain't stopping. Not now. Not when we're this close to turning things around." Her frustration flared again, hot and sharp. "Dawson Hale, I swear, if you keep smirking like none of this matters, it matters." His voice was firm now. "It matters a hell of a lot. But sitting around feeling sorry don't fix fences. And it sure don't fix bank notices, so your big plan is just keep going." "Damn right it is." He stepped a little closer, eyes locked on hers. "And guess what? You're cumin with me, I'm not. You are." "I can't." "You can. I'm serious. Dawson, so am I." She stared at him. He held that stare, smirk still tugging at his mouth, not because he didn't care, but because he refused to let fear decide anything for either of them. Finally, he turned away, just slightly, jerking his head toward the barn. "Grab your gloves. We start with the north fence. If we don't patch it today, we'll lose another 2 head before sunrise." Clara opened her mouth to argue. He was already walking, already continuing, like he always did. Like nothing, not even her breaking voice, could slow him down. She watched him for several long seconds, her breath shaking, her heart pounding, her frustration simmering hot beneath her ribs. Then she whispered, barely audible, "Damn you, Dawson." But she followed him because she always did. And because deep down, no matter how much she hated admitting it, he was the only one who never walked away when the world pushed back. The moment Mason stepped out of that barn, slamming the door behind him as if he needed physical space just to breathe, she stood frozen in the middle of the room. The smell of hay, the soft shuffle of the horses, the dust drifting slow like falling snow, none of it calmed the way her chest tightened, because she knew he wasn't angry at her. He wasn't annoyed by what she said, he was fighting himself, and that more than anything terrified her in a way she couldn't admit out loud. She dragged in a shaky breath and wiped her palms down her jeans, feeling the heat still burning across her skin from the way he looked at her moments earlier. That storm in his eyes wasn't confusion, or irritation, or even temptation. No, it was a man holding back something he had kept caged for far too long. Something he didn't trust himself with. Something he thought might break her if he ever let it loose. But she wasn't fragile. She wasn't some porcelain thing that needed to be handled with gloves and soft voices. She left everything behind to be here, her old life, her predictable days, her safe choices. She came because something in him called to her, even when he barely said a word. And she wasn't about to let him run from that now. She stepped out of the barn and felt the crisp late afternoon air wash over her face. The sun was sinking low, stretched across the sky like a slow-moving fire, turning everything gold: his land, his fences, even the dust swirling at her feet. And there he was, Mason, standing at the fence line with his head down, hand gripping the top rail like he needed something solid to ground himself. He didn't look back when she approached, didn't flinch when her shadow fell over the ground beside him. But he felt her, she could tell by the way his jaw clenched, a faint ripple of tension running through him like a pulled wire. She spoke softly, because anger wasn't what either of them needed right now. "Mason, talk to me." His laugh was barely a breath, but it carried so much bitterness it stung her skin. "Talking's not the problem, sweetheart." "Then what is?" He finally turned his head, just enough for her to see the fire in his eyes again. "You don't know what you're asking for." She stepped closer, maybe too close, but she didn't care. "Maybe I do." "No," he said, and the word came out so low it rumbled in her chest. "You think you can handle me? You think this is some slow burn, movie scene tension that ends with a pretty kiss and soft music in the background?" His gaze swept her face, fierce and tortured. "But you're wrong. I'm not gentle. I'm not careful, and I don't get to lose control." She didn't step back. If anything, she moved closer. "Who told you that? Who convinced you that you're a danger to people just because you feel something strongly?" He huffed, shaking his head. "It's not about feeling something strongly. It's about what happens when I stop holding everything back. You saw it. You felt it." She had all she absolutely had. That moment in the barn where it felt like the whole world shrank down to just the two of them, the pool, the heat, the tension thick enough to drown in. But she didn't fear it. She craved it, not because she wanted recklessness, but because she recognized truth when it stood right in front of her. "You didn't scare me," she whispered. "That's the problem," he muttered. "You should be scared. You should run back to your city life where men don't." He cut himself off, closing his eyes like the words were too heavy to push out. She reached up, gently touching his arm, not grabbing, not pulling, just making contact. His muscles jumped beneath her hand like he wasn't used to being touched without a reason, without expectation, without someone wanting something from him. "Mason," she murmured, "you're not going to hurt me." His voice dropped even lower. "Not on purpose, not at all," she countered. He shook his head again, but this time it wasn't in frustration, it was more like disbelief, like he couldn't understand how she could look at him and not see a threat. But she didn't. She saw a man who had carried too much for too long, a man who worked hard, lived quietly, felt deeply, and hid everything that made him human behind a wall of silence and self-control. She stepped in front of him, forcing his gaze to meet hers. "You think I'm fragile, that I'll shatter if I get too close. But I'm here because I chose this. I chose you." He looked like she'd punched the air out of him, his chest stilled, his shoulders locked, his eyes widened, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous for a man like him: vulnerability. "I didn't ask you to choose me," he said. "No," she agreed, voice soft but firm. "You didn't, but that doesn't change the fact that I did." Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. The fading sunlight painted him in warm gold, tracing the hard lines of his jaw, the scars on his knuckles, the faded exhaustion around his eyes. She wondered how long he'd been carrying this belief that he was too much for anyone, too intense, too harsh, too dangerous. She reached up again, this time touching his face. His breath hitched when her fingers brushed his jawline, like the contact shocked him. "Mason, I'm not scared of you," she said slowly, making sure he heard every word. "I'm scared of losing you before I even get the chance to know you." He swallowed hard, like the words physically hit him somewhere deep. His chest rose, shaky and uneven. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes," she whispered. "I do." His hands curled around the fence railing, gripping it so tightly the wood groaned. It felt like he was holding himself in place with sheer force, like letting go even for a second would send everything spiraling. She watched him breathe, slow and tortured, eyes locked on hers like she was the only anchor he had left. "I can't take this anymore," she whispered, and the moment the words left her lips, his eyes snapped up to hers fully wide, startled, dark. She repeated it, but this time she stepped closer, the last of the distance disappearing. "I can't take pretending anymore. I can't take you pulling away every time things get intense, like it's something to fear." He opened his mouth, ready to argue, but she pressed a finger gently to his lips. "And I know you can't take it either," she murmured. He froze completely. Like her words cut straight through that wall, he kept reinforcing every time she got too close. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind stirred the dust around their boots, the sun dipped lower, and the field grew quiet, so quiet it felt like even the world was waiting for him to respond. Finally, slowly, painfully, he closed his eyes and whispered, "You don't know what you're inviting yet," she said, her voice barely above breath. "I do." He opened his eyes again, and this time there was no wall, no hesitation, just raw, unfiltered intensity. The kind that made her heart slam into her ribs. The kind he'd been trying to hide since the day she arrived. The kind that promised everything and warned her that once he stepped into it, there would be no turning back. But she didn't want him to turn back. Not now. Not ever. Before she could say another word, he stepped away from the fence, closing the distance between them in a slow, deliberate movement that sent heat curling through her stomach. He stopped inches from her, breath brushing her skin, eyes locked on hers with a focus that made her knees weaken. He lifted a hand, paused, almost like he needed permission. She whispered, "Mason, it's okay," and that was the moment, the shift she'd been waiting for. The moment he stopped fighting what he felt and finally let it happen. The moment the rancher stopped holding back. The moment he touched her, the world seemed to shift. Not in a loud, clanging way, but in the subtle, terrifying kind of shift that knocks the air out of your lungs before you even realize it. Mason's hands were steady at first, tentative almost, but there was a tension coiled beneath the surface, like a wild stallion waiting to bolt. Every inch of him radiated restraint and raw power, and the closer he came, the more she felt that magnetic pull, like she was both anchor and flame. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. She'd wanted this, craved this, for longer than she could admit. And now that it was happening, now that it was heat and control brushed against her skin, she knew she couldn't turn back, even if part of her mind screamed caution. That caution didn't stand a chance. His eyes bore into hers, and the intensity of his gaze left no room for doubt. He wasn't here to test her limits. He wasn't here to play games. Everything about him was focused, deliberate, the kind of focus that made her pulse spike in a way she'd never known was possible. It scared her, yes, but in the same breath, it thrilled her beyond words. She felt alive, unafraid, and utterly vulnerable all at once. And yet, for all the fire and heat between them, there was a slow, almost sacred rhythm to his actions. Each movement measured, each glance loaded with 1,000 unsaid words. He was breaking rules she hadn't even realized existed, the rules she had built around herself to stay safe, but he wasn't cruel, not in the way she feared. There was a reverence to it, an understanding that made the intensity bearable, that made it something she wanted, something she needed. The air grew heavier, the sun dipping lower, painting the horizon in streaks of molten gold and crimson, casting long shadows that mirrored the tension winding through her body. Time seemed to stretch, each second a drawn-out heartbeat. Every touch, every glance, every subtle shift in his stance told her a story she'd been waiting years to hear. And now, standing here, the truth of it all was laid bare between them. "Mason," she whispered, voice trembling not from fear but from the overwhelming surge of emotion. I've never felt anything like this." His lips twitched almost a smirk, but it was tempered by something deeper, something raw and real. "You don't know what this is," he murmured, voice low, hoarse, vibrating with the intensity of all he'd held back. "Not fully, not yet." She shook her head slightly, pressing closer without fear. "I don't care. I don't want to know fully. I want this you now." And that seemed to shatter the last of his restraint. Mason's breath hitched, his hands tightening ever so slightly as if he feared losing control, as if he had to remind himself that he could. But then he let go of the hesitation, and everything changed. The way he moved, the way his gaze softened ever so slightly before intensifying again, it was a man finally embracing what he had spent so long denying. And she matched him, every tremble of fear replaced with exhilaration, every heartbeat a drum keeping pace with his own. The first kiss wasn't gentle, it wasn't tentative, it was deliberate, searing, the kind that left echoes on her skin long after he pulled back even slightly. Her hands found his shoulders, then his chest, as if trying to memorize every line, every curve, every inch of him. And Mason, for all his rugged exterior, let himself melt into her, releasing the pent-up tension of months, maybe years, in that single, searing connection. She pulled back just slightly, gasping, eyes wide, feeling the wildness of the moment like a storm raging in her chest. "Mason, what are you doing to me?" she whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief. He smiled, dark, dangerous, utterly magnetic. "Showing you what you've been asking for," he murmured. "Showing you me." And it was true. Every touch, every careful yet unrestrained movement, every whispered word between them spoke of a man who had been hiding pieces of himself away from the world, pieces he now shared with her, pieces she had begged to see without even knowing it. And she embraced them, heart and soul, because nothing else had ever felt this raw, this real, this alive. The barn faded behind them, the fields stretching endless around them. But all that mattered was the closeness, the electricity crackling between their bodies. She couldn't distinguish where she ended and he began, and for the first time she didn't want to. Every breath, every heartbeat, every shiver of skin against skin bound them in a way that felt eternal. The world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment that would etch itself into memory forever. His hands moved with a confidence and gentleness that belied the ferocity of his intent. Every brush, every grip, every whisper of motion told her he was aware of her limits but didn't fear pushing them carefully, intentionally, safely. She let herself go, trusted him, and the walls she had built around herself crumbled one by one. There was nothing left but raw, unfiltered connection. She gasped again, the intensity building until it was almost unbearable. And Mason's voice cut through the haze, low and commanding. "I can't hold back anymore," he admitted, almost as if he had been holding himself prisoner for too long. "I can't hide it. I can't ignore it. Not with you." She pressed closer, hands entwined in his forehead resting against his chest. "Then don't ever." And he didn't. Mason's restraint fell away, replaced by a kind of passion tempered only by respect and care. Every motion, every glance, every subtle command between them spoke of the boundaries they had built and now dared to cross. They had danced around this moment for so long, and now that it had arrived, it consumed them utterly. There was no shame, no hesitation. Only the fire of mutual desire, the heady thrill of vulnerability, and the exhilarating freedom of shared trust. Time became irrelevant. The sun disappeared entirely, leaving them in the shadowed glow of evening, yet they felt warmer than any midday sun could provide. The night was quiet around them, but inside, a storm of emotion and sensation raged unchecked. Mason's hands held her like he feared she might vanish, like she was the most precious thing he had ever touched. And she responded in kind, holding him, feeling him, letting herself surrender to the whirlwind that had drawn them together from the very first day. Finally, when the storm inside them subsided just enough for breath, Mason pulled back slightly, forehead resting against hers, eyes dark, intent, alive. You're insane," he breathed, voice rough with emotion and exertion. "Completely insane." She laughed softly, a shaky, exhilarated sound that matched the tremor still coursing through her body. "And you love it," she whispered. He smirked, finally allowing the edges of humor to creep into his dark intensity. Maybe more than I should." They stood like that for a long moment, bodies pressed close, hearts still racing, breaths mingling in the space between them. The field, the barn, the sunless sky, they didn't matter anymore. Only this, only them. Only the fire that had been contained for far too long now set free, blazing beyond control but somehow perfectly safe in the warmth of their shared surrender. When at last they parted just enough to look at one another fully, her lips curled into a triumphant, breathless smile. "I told you. I can't take this pretending anymore." His laugh, deep and relieved, rumbled through the night. "No kidding," he muttered, shaking his head, yet the grin in his eyes betrayed everything he felt. The walls, the hesitation, the fear, all of it had melted away. And in that instant, he realized that some boundaries, some rules, were meant to be broken, but only with the right person. She rested her head against his chest again, hearing the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel fragile. She didn't feel scared. She felt alive. And Mason, with all his strength, his intensity, his unapologetic presence, had shown her exactly what that meant. The rancher had crossed every line she feared, yet somehow, in doing so, had made everything feel possible. And in that quiet, electric night, with the stars just beginning to pierce the darkened sky, they both knew one undeniable truth: nothing would ever be the same again. Nothing. Not their hearts, not their lives, not the fire they had just unleashed, because some moments once lived last forever.